Hi there. Welcome to Revenue Management Solutions Revenue Stream. The title for this is Pricing in Motion, Navigating Dynamic Pricing for Restaurants. Certainly a hot topic. My name is Alicia Kelso. I'm the executive editor of Nation's Restaurant News. Today for my panel, I'm going to be joined by my esteemed panelist, Sherri from the Cornell University School of Hotel Administration, Alfonso Delgado from Solution Development Partners, Mike Halen from Bloomberg, and Dora Furman from Revenue Management Solutions. Hi, everybody. Good to see you.
Hi.
Great to see you too.
Like I mentioned, obviously I covered the industry and I can't tell you there's a couple topics, but this is certainly top of mind, for restaurant operators, particularly this year. And I would argue that dynamic pricing has probably gotten a little bit of a bad rap lately. Wendy's sort of inadvertently got a ball rolling here in February 2024 that it was going to test dynamic pricing, and that was met with some backlash because they called the strategy surge pricing, or some headlines called the strategy surge pricing, and obviously that led to a public outcry that sort of forced the chain to back off those statements a little bit. But as we mentioned earlier, dynamic pricing, which is essentially adjusting prices and offerings in real time based on changing market conditions and, of course, consumer demand, is nothing new. Other industries like ride sharing, hotels, and airlines have been using this practice for several years now. And restaurants obviously has had happy hour, which is, along the lines of dynamic pricing, of course. But despite happy hour, this is obviously still a very relatively new conversation for our industry. So we're going to talk to you, our panel of restaurant experts, and sort of delve deeper into how operators can navigate, these public perceptions and deploy some of these pricing strategies. So I'm going to start with a question for all of you, if I can. And in the spirit of tidiness, Sherri, we're going to kick off with you. What do you think of this concept? Share your stance on dynamic pricing with that backdrop of the awkward conversation that's happening right now.
Well, I like to think of dynamic pricing as being kind of happy hour on steroids. That's a good way of thinking about it. And the other part of it is that, as you pointed out, Alicia, it's been around for a long time. It's all a matter of communication. And so, I think where poor Wendy's ran into trouble, because when I read all of that, oh my goodness, their communications office must be having a fit. They just used the wrong term because they didn't frame it as a gain for the consumers. And not surprisingly, there was a backlash. And so I don't think there's anything, it's been around a long time, but the key is how you communicate the concept to your customers.
Okay. What do you think, Alfonso?
Well, I think I'm, similar to Sherri, I'm a big fan. I'm a believer and actually an advocate of dynamic pricing. And for multiple reasons, right? First one is quite self-serving, but I've been making a living with this for the last 25 years. So, that makes me a big fan. The second one, I think, is the most organic way to align the value of a product with the price of that product, right? An item at the end of the day is worth what somebody's willing to pay for it. And dynamic pricing allows you to keep that balance and relationship over time. And it's going to change over time, right? And I think actually dynamic pricing can be better for consumers because it can actually result in more supply of a product or a service at prices that make it more affordable to a bigger audience, right? So, this example is a bit dated back, 50 years ago when the airline deregulated pricing, it made flying much more accessible to people that before couldn't afford to fly. I think when it looks at restaurants, you could actually make a restaurant, more affordable in certain occasions to people that otherwise, couldn't pay for it, right? The only thing I will advocate is that maybe along the lines of Sherri's comments is maybe it needs to be rebranded. Maybe we should talk about dynamic discounting instead of dynamic pricing, right? Because it's all about how you frame the proposition to the consumer, right? So it's like, I'm always going to give you a deal. I might give you more or less of a deal, but, the element of dynamic is actually to the advantage of the customer.
Fair point. I think that we talk too much about up and not as much as we should about down. Mike, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, listen, I think it's tricky. To Alfonso's point, when you're offering some discounts, I think it's a lot more palatable. But restaurants, it's not a vacation, it's not a hotel, and it's not a flight, right? price points are extremely critical to the decision-making process of where you're going to go to lunch, right? It's either the first or the second thing you're probably thinking about for most people across the country, not for everybody. But, how do you do it, right? Like lunch speed is a very important consideration. So if I show up at a Chili's and it happens to be packed, well, now I'm going to be late for my 1 p.m. meeting and I got to pay more. It's not going to work for me. So, discounts, leveraging the box at top periods of the day when it's slow. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense to me. Maybe if you're trying to promote a new day part, right? And so you technically don't have any breakfast customers yet. And so you're trying to draw from your pool of lunch and dinner customers. To me, that makes more sense in terms of surge pricing. Maybe a fine dining, very elevated type of brand can get away with that, but it's going to be few and far between.
Sure. Okay. And we'll dive deeper into some of those points in this conversation, but that's a good start here. Dora, we'll finish this opening question with you. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I think everyone has kind of touched upon a number of the things that I'm thinking about, but I think there is a place for it, like in the restaurant industry. And a lot of it is about that communication and timing. So Mike brought up the idea of fine dining, and which was being done in Alinea in Chicago, right? If there's finite number of seats and Saturday, 7 p.m., there's acceptance, which really aligns with how consumers are already trained to think about when it comes to booking a hotel room and flights. It's been around for decades. And so there is definitely a place if there's an understanding, like in a fine dining where there's finite seats. Obviously, with COVID and the elevation of delivery, we are seeing there is surge pricing. So there is this already play on dynamic pricing. And there's been acceptance because there's an understanding that there's only so many cars that are physically delivering. So a lot of it goes to consumers' understanding and that transparency of what might be driving it versus, in QSR, I think there's this understanding where it's unlimited supply, right? I think that's the hurdle when we think about fast food. Like, well, why is there a limitation? And just the queue in the line. But if I'm waiting in the drive-through line for an hour, why would I suddenly be charged more for that burger? So I think there is a time and place, but it really comes back to the comments here as far as that transparency and that communication, and also kind of that timing of that decision. And are you able to have the opportunity to make that decision versus feeling that you're gouged? 100% agree with the opportunity to use dynamic pricing from a discounting perspective. And as we lean into that, I think a lot of our clients will have opportunities to lean into more discounting dynamic pricing.
Very good. All of you touched on this, at least, briefly, but I want to extract a little bit more here from that initial question in what aspects of this idea of dynamic pricing then could work for restaurants and what will not work for restaurants. And we'll go same order. Sherri, we'll start with you.
I think the biggest thing, again, is thinking about the consumer. And if you look at this, and I'm a professor, so I got to go back to the research, right? Is that there's so much research. I mean, a couple of Nobel Prize winners talking about, it's called prospect theory. And you always want to frame things as a win for consumers, because the way we process wins and losses are different. And so what's a win? Well, I got a deal. And if you think about the way the hotel and airline industry do it, the hotel industry in specific, they talk about rack rate. Everything is a discount off of that. Hotels don't do surge pricing. They always give you discounts off of rack rate. Now, what percentage of people pay rack rate? Less than 5%. Right. But it's the way that it's communicated. And I think, but back to the points that others have been making, is that there are times when we need the demand. We need to build the demand. And so I think, again, it's coming back to the communication, which comes from the research, is where are the situations where you can provide value for your customers? Because if you do that, they're going to be happy, you're going to be happy, and you're not going to get that kind of backlash, or you're trying to rip me off.
Sure. Okay. Alfonso, what are your thoughts here on what could work and what couldn't?
Yeah, I think one of the key elements, I believe, is that however you approach the price setting, the results have to be rational to the customer, right? The consumer has to understand why the price is different, right? There are some environments where people try to apply dynamic pricing in a sneaky, covert way, and that doesn't work, right? You have to be able to explain with a straight face to the customer, yes, the price is different, and this is the reason why. And I believe that a key element of that is make them understand that the product or the service they're purchasing is different. People are very adverse to pay different prices for the same product. So we have to make clear that the product itself they're purchasing is different, right? Now, if in the restaurant environment you think that all you're purchasing is cooked food, it's very difficult to justify why the same food will cost more on a Friday evening than a Tuesday afternoon, right? But if we really find that what you're purchasing is something else beyond the food, then the conversation is very different, right? So if you want to have access to a popular restaurant with short notice, the accessibility to that table is part of what you're purchasing, right? That's the added value. So that's why customers that maybe committed to book that table weeks ago might be paying less. Or if you want to have the flexibility of canceling your reservation up to the day before when you're going to have your meal, right? That flexibility is part of what you're purchasing, right? So maybe customers that prepaid their meal 2 weeks ago actually are getting a better price. Or the convenience of having a meal at 11 p.m. or delivered to your house on a day that is snowing, right? That convenience is also part of what you're purchasing. So once we really frame what the service or product you're providing really is, now people will understand, added value should also mean, added price.
So all of this comes down to holistically communicating the why behind this dynamic pricing issue is what I'm hearing. Dora, do you have something to add to that? I mean, it seems so simple on paper, but we're having a hard time executing here, right? So Dora, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely comes down to the why. It's really interesting, and when we think about the restaurant industry and how that why would be different from QSR to fine dining, and I think that's with the Wendy's situation, I think people are just thinking about the menu board. You go through that drive-through, and now that same item is different at different times, and that's really the perception that's out there. And so, I think it is about if there's QSR, they're going to go that route. What would be dynamic, right? And I think there could be some opportunity, some place. Do you offer some premium, really cool milkshake that has limited ingredients and it's this hot item and it's coming to marketing? And could that be something within the menu that has some surge dynamic pricing element because there's limited supply, right? So I think there could be some play within QSR, but I think it would be finite, right? And it's the dealing. I think you have opportunities to deal based on day part, and also with your loyalty, your group of loyalty customers. I think that's a really big opportunity because you've got this group where you could play with dynamic pricing because you could shoot. If you're seeing your volume is lagging in the day, you could shoot out a text message based on your preferred location and offer a deal right away. And so that gives you a little bit more opportunity. It's a little bit more defined, but I feel that would probably be kind of the first places. And we're already using kind of that CRM model to do deals. I think it's a little bit more pre-planned generally. It's not, literally to the hour, but if we were going to get into true live dynamic, that would be a place where there'd be some opportunity coming from a QSR front on the early side. But I do feel I feel the industry is still far from really implementing it everywhere. And I think that's where it gets tricky because if it's not everyone, then the customer has a choice of where to go. And that's where it becomes a problem because if a certain location is using dynamic pricing, you're not going to go there. You're going to go somewhere where you have truth in the numbers. You've got their normal regular pricing. And so that's where it's like, who makes the move first? And everyone's kind of waiting. But if everyone's doing it, then it really could change the landscape. But sure. I think we're a ways away because of all the consumer reactions and psychology behind it.
Well, and that is a good transition. Sherri, I'm going to start with you to sort of drill a little deeper on some of those, overarching themes that we just touched on, because you said it yourself, you're a professor, so you know the data pretty well here. And as everybody has discussed, much of this controversy, and pushback has been primarily due to semantics. So what is your suggestion here, being close to this topic, on reframing this for the restaurant industry. So it isn't far from implementing. So it isn't behind on another thing that is advantageous from a tech standpoint from other industries.
Well, first of all, don't call it dynamic pricing, right? I mean, because that has the bad reputation associated with it. I mean, I think the other thing with it too is always thinking about. I mean, thinking about it from the consumer's perspective, and also the fact that you don't want to take away customer control. In the hotel industry, if I go back to that industry, back 40 years ago, 30 years ago, when they were starting, they basically just let people. They were just charging. They were doing what Alfonso said. Why were they charging different prices? Because they could charge different prices, right? And not surprisingly, there was a lot of customer backlash. And they said, okay, look, we've got to come up with, and Alfonso said this, is that we've got to have reasons why people pay different prices. And so that is back to the control. The other thing that matters a whole lot in the hotel and airline industry, we call the reasons that people pay different prices, we call those rate fences. And one of my friends from Marriott said, and he's kind of funny and cynical at the same time, he said, a rate fence is anything we could say out loud at the front desk without laughing. But it's a reason why people pay different prices. So Dora said, okay, maybe they're a member of the loyalty program. Maybe they are a senior. Maybe they're this, but there is a reason why. And then customers can choose to either go for that price or not go for that price. If you take away customer control, and there's lots of research on this, and we all know this in our gut, if you take away customer controls, like Mike said, I'm waiting, I'm there at a busy time, and I got to have my lunch, and now you're going to charge me more? I mean, no, I'm not interested. And I think but again, it's back to the consumer and, making sure that there's a reason and never, ever taking away control.
Sure. Okay. Well, it coincidentally polled consumers on this topic recently, from what I understand. So, and I have here, you found that respondents had more positive opinions of pricing terms like happy hour and Taco Tuesday associated with providing value for customers. They were the least positive terms, to your point, was dynamic pricing and surge pricing. Is this just a matter of restaurants latching on to national days of something? I mean,
I think it's just the term dynamic pricing. I think that, well, what's even worse than dynamic pricing to the consumers is surge pricing, because you think about it, I mean, it is taking away control. And even Uber, I mean, Uber will, they've kind of changed the way they do it a little bit. But if you're getting some sort of a super high price, you have a choice. And I'm sure we've all had that. I've gotten some Uber, that comes up, it's going to be this much. I go, no, I'm not really that interested. But sometimes I remember one time I had to go to a wedding reception. It was like, okay, fine, I'll do it. But I still had that choice. And again, it's the terminology. So I say, don't call it dynamic pricing. I mean, we could come up with something, our strategic pricing, our customer value proposition. I mean, it's or just don't even mention it.
Sure.
I think that might even be a better approach.
I'll tell you, if we could just call everything happy hour, I'd be all in.
Yeah.
I'm conditioned that way now.
Well, it's kind of, and then I had this wonderful, there's a really bright guy who called me one time, and he said, he's done a lot of restaurant tech work, Eli Chait, and he said, how do I design the optimal happy hour? And I said, I have no idea, but your question is phenomenal, because that's exactly what we're talking about, right? What should that offer be?
Sure. Very good. Well, Sonic did it. I mean, we don't have to necessarily talk about libations. They've got happy hour from, I think, 2 to 5, and it's their most successful day part. So hopefully there's, maybe they're solving the semantics puzzle here. Alfonso, I want to sort of shift, over to you, because something that has sort of taken off here in my head as everybody's talking is all of these other industries. 30 years ago, the hotel industry was starting to do this. Of course, airlines and Uber have done this. And, here we find the restaurant industry yet again, playing catch up here on something that is tech driven, when we were starting to make up a lot of ground after the pandemic on all things tech related. What This is sort of a two-part question. What do you think we can learn from dynamic pricing models in these other industries that have been doing it, and doing it well for decades? And I'm curious, is it easier for those industries to sort of get away with this because they're bigger ticket items, where they're not worried about 3 to 5%, margins to protect and turning off every single customer that could potentially come in here? What is the disconnect there?
I don't know that it's a margins issue, because the airline margin could be even thinner than the restaurant margin in many situations. So I don't think it's a margins issue. I think it's twofold. One is, I think it's a matter of, it's been done for a long time, and it takes a fair amount of time for consumers to get used to something. I mean, airlines have been doing it for nearly 50 years. Hotels for not as long, but almost as long. The other element is that the concept of perishable inventory is much clearer on the consumer's mind when they think of a hotel room or an airline seat than it is of a seat hour on a restaurant. For us, we think, no, capacity is capacity. In the restaurant, you measure it differently, but it's all perishable inventory. I don't think consumers make that connection as easily as they do with a flight or with a hotel. I think looking at those other industries, I think an element that we discussed earlier is you have to be very clear on why the value proposition is different, and therefore why is it worth more? Is it convenience? Is it accessibility? Is it flexibility? Is it amount of time you spend in the restaurant? The other piece that I think works for those other industries is that you have to be consistent on how you change price, right? That means that you want to have very good forecasting models and cancellation forecasting models, etc., right? Predictability is very good when you make those decisions, but it's also very good for the customer because they will know what to expect over time. Right now, everybody knows that the closer to departure that you book a flight, typically you will pay more, right? And that's been a matter. That's how everybody likes to operate from an airline perspective when setting prices, but consumers have actually learned that behavior. The other piece that I think it's, important in the spirit of transparency is to set the expectations of likely or upcoming price increases. Do tell consumers that prices will go up, right? I mean, now you go to book a hotel and they say you have 3 rooms left at this price, right? Or you go book an airline seat. So you know that the prices will change, but you're made aware of it, right? And awareness goes a long way towards getting consumers to accept. And then, focus on the benefits again on why is the higher price item better, right? Why is dynamic pricing better? Uber has come up a lot here. And their narrative is that surge pricing actually entices more drivers to get off their couch and out on the road driving. And that means there is more cars available for people that want to get an Uber ride. So try to flip it on kind of what's in it for the consumer as opposed to what's in it for me, right? And the last piece is that it doesn't have to be only about changing the price of existing products. I think you can do a lot through assortment, right? You could say during my peak periods, I'm going to remove some of the products of my menu that might be lower price, lower margin. And, that is going to naturally drive customers to the higher price, higher margin items, right? So I'm working with a hotel client, and their bar assortment, actually, we have 2 tiers for stronger breaks and weaker breaks. And what you actually do is you replace a lot of the products from the lower end and you expand the higher end, more expensive, higher margin products. So you will never pay 2 different prices for the same product, but the set of choices presented to you are depending on how busy and how much demand a particular break. So I think it's all about, again, communication. I think transparency goes a long way.
Tell me then, it's a great point, but now that we've got decades, as mentioned, of sort of case studies on how this has worked and maybe what hasn't worked in those other industries. Is there anything top of mind for you, Alfonso, that has not worked, that we shouldn't take away from those industries from their, their years of experience here?
Yeah. I mean, a few things I think to avoid, right? One of them is, don't try and trick the customer. They are smart. They learn very fast. Today, with social media and all the consumer groups that are out there, this travels like wildfire, right? Nobody likes better than bashing on the latest company or industry that is trying to take advantage of consumers through dynamic pricing. I mean, Sherri and I, as I was saying earlier, every 4 or 5 months, we share the latest Ticketmaster, dress down that happens in, press all over the world. So it's very the stigma of having unfair pricing is very difficult to shake off and can be very, very detrimental, right? The other piece is that don't be greedy. Don't try to capture 100% of the consumer surplus, right? So share some of that consumer surplus with the customer so they can feel good about their purchase, right? I mean, we've all been at airports when you end up paying $4 for a bottle of Evian and you say, come on, guys, I mean, could it be $3.50? Let's split the difference here. The other thing is that I think you need to make sure you avoid, what could be perceived as predatory pricing. So I think you want to set up an upper limit of how far up would you actually increase the price as a function of demand, right? You want to avoid this, I'm selling snow shovels for $400 before a snowstorm, right? I think it has to be reasonable vis-a-vis the traditional or the normal price. And the last piece that this works a lot, on the airline and the hotel and the cruise environment is that if you're adjusting prices, try to always be moving on the same direction, especially if you are increasing, right? So don't overshoot the price increase, then go back down, then go back up, right? So you want to avoid that kind of seesaw pattern because that means that you become less predictable and it becomes less fair for the customer, right? So I think these are mistakes that, in those industries have happened before. They still happen quite a bit. And I think as we try to implement this within the restaurant industry, we want to make sure we don't step on those landmines that are out there.
Sure. And you bring up a really interesting point of overshooting. And I would argue that the industry has overshot some pricing in the past year and a half, which is why we're seeing some significant traffic erosions and, sort of an exodus, in droves to grocery stores, unfortunately. And I think this year has been a little bit more challenged than any of us expect. I think we all expected some softening, but not quite to this level. Mike, I want to bring you in here because this is your level of expertise, certainly not mine. Patrons are looking for deals everywhere. We're seeing McDonald's extending their $5 meal deal and everybody else following suit. Obviously, this is a value-driven environment. What do you think dynamic pricing, how can dynamic pricing play a role in this environment now where consumers are significantly more discerning? Can it offer a solution, for operators to maybe sort of reignite some traffic here?
Yeah, to your point, it's been hard to pass through price this year. People are pushing back, right? And so, the traffic's declined at QSR chains in 36 of the last 38 months, right? It's people are pushing back. They're sick of paying higher prices. There's been a ton of bad press, talking about the $18 Big Mac, $22 Smash Burger or whatever it was, Five Guys, I think it was actually $22 or $23. And people are struggling to keep up. So can dynamic pricing help? I think so, right? I don't think it's going to be easy to execute though, right? Like you don't want to be Tim Hortons. Like Tim Hortons puts out a loyalty program and all it did was give discounts to people that were going to come anyway. Right. So like to me, one-to-one marketing is vastly superior, right? And I know that's still got a long way to go too, but you could target lapsed customers. You can target your dinner only customers with a deal at breakfast and at lunch, right? So you're not giving discounts away to just anybody.
Given then, this inflationary environment, we touched upon this a little bit earlier when we talked about margins. What alternative tactics then to dynamic pricing do you think operators could maybe think of to protect their margins? Because that's the challenge here. They got to find that sweet spot. You want traffic to come back, but we got to protect our margins here. What are your thoughts on other solutions here?
Yeah, sure. For the record, we were pretty negative on restaurant sales this year. We're actually more concerned about margins next year. So I think this is an important question. It's walking a tightrope, right? Quote unquote, protecting your margins. Traffic loss. If you raise your prices too much and you lose traffic, then you start getting sales to leverage, right? So, that's one of the worst things that can happen to your margins. Driving top line through traffic is the best way to increase your margins in this business, right? And so, you look at a Chipotle, you look at a Texas Roadhouse. Those are like the best examples of the companies I cover that are driving customers into the restaurants and expanding their margins in a difficult environment, right? Strategic pricing is obviously something that's very important. I'm going to bring up Chipotle again because they seem to have been able to raise prices pretty much more than most other chains, and yet it's not impacting their traffic like it is most other chains. And so people still see value on the plate there. And so being able to price down to the store level has been a big advantage for some of our chains. It's a big opportunity still for many of them though as well that are kind of lagging behind. Optimization of labor is a big one, right? You want to make sure the restaurant is staffed well at the times it needs to be staffed well, right? And you're really optimizing that labor and running an efficient operation. You also want to make the jobs easier for the people in the back of the house, right? So over the last decade, there's been a lot about eliminating steps and, at Starbucks and McDonald's and all of these chains to help retain the labor that they do have. I mean, I think chains have to look at every single line item on the P&L right now, right? Right now, food costs, there's been a ton of inflation. Food service chains, after decades of restaurants squeezing the hell out of them, now seem to be in a better position, and they're pushing back on price. And so, food isn't really a great line for them to be squeezing savings out of. You don't want to cut back on the quality of the food, because then you're going to also see another traffic decline, right? So every other line item of the P&L that you could possibly think of, food waste, whatever it is, repairs and maintenance, sharpening your knives, whatever it possibly is, you have to dig down onto every line item of that P&L. Olive Garden was another one. They're only doing third-party delivery through their app. I think, you can criticize them for being slow to that party, but they took their time and they're doing it right. And they're only allowing people to order third-party delivery through their app. And so they're able to keep the prices on the menu the same or very similar. And I think it's going to pay dividends. It's probably going to grow slower than it has in some of its competitors, but I think their margins will be protected.
Sure. Love your points here. One of my favorite conversations, and I actually went through a couple of quarters of earnings calls just to extract the word efficiency. And I think I can't remember the number, it was like 72 times it was mentioned on earnings calls for restaurant companies. If we pull any positives from, the pandemic, it is that we are focused on efficiencies and throughput and retention, to your points, and drilling down into every line item of the P&L. We've always been doing that, I think, as a tight, margin business, but the conversation has definitely changed, and it shows that we don't just have to take pricing. We can find, solutions in other ways. Removing those steps in the back of house is a great point, a great example here. I'm curious, while I've got you, Mike, how do we look at our competitors then with this pricing conversation that we've had, that has turned off a lot of consumers? How can dynamic pricing or even any other pricing strategies that are related to competitors be used by operators? What should they have top of mind here?
Yeah, that's tough. Marketing is key. And so I'm not a marketer by trade. But, what we've seen is some of the chains that are really outperforming some of their competitors are using marketing as a tool, and they're targeting some of their customers' practices to kind of gain traffic themselves. Chili's is one that that immediately comes to mind, right? They've been pushing their $10.99 Big Smasher burger, which is similar to a Big Mac, but with a lot more beef and bottomless chips and salsa for $10.99. And they're showing a picture of a sad QSR burger in a styrofoam container, and then they switch over to their burger, which looks amazing, of course, on the ads. But it's working for them. It's really resonating with people, and it's boosting their lunch business. So marketing is key, and for the chains we cover, the chains that are doing the best job of marketing their products and finding opportunities to take shots at competitors, they're outperforming.
Okay, that's interesting. Products and taking shots at competitors are the two marketing tactics that are working. I want to shift back to the conversation. We touched on it earlier about this transparency. Obviously, it's a little bit deeper than just communication, but going a step further and being transparent with customers. One is a little broader, obviously. Sherri, I want to kick this over to you first, and then Dora, I kind of want your thoughts here about this transparency in pricing and how restaurants can manage, that consumer sentiment while they're adjusting their prices dynamically. What are your, I guess your piece of advice on not just maintaining appropriate amount of communication, but transparent communication?
And I think it's back to the happy hour on steroids. We know when happy hour is, and we don't always know exactly what happy hour is, but we know we like that term, right? And so, I think it's having the prices out there so customers know what they would be charging. The other thing, and this is, you kind of made the comment, and Mike was talking about this too, is that we don't just have pricing, right? There's all sorts of things that can be done with menu design. Alfonso mentioned this too. Okay, well, we don't, during a peak period, we don't have our low margin items on there, the ones that take a long time. Those aren't on the menu. And so there are other ways to do this while still maintaining transparency to the consumer, but we have control over what we're displaying to them. And I think that's something we really should not forget.
Very good. Dora, do you have added thoughts there on the transparency conversation?
So something interesting, wanted to bring up a recent study that we did, which as much as the timing of the disclosure becomes a part of this transparency, right? So when does the consumer know? So Sherri brought up, okay, it's a happy hour and that it's going to be discounted, but that's actually pre-established. It's typically there's marketing and menu boards and they have set time. So it's truly not dynamic in the sense that it's suddenly, $2.59 and they decide to run a deal, because that's how happy hours have typically in large organizations. They can't implement change quick enough, right? But that becomes that you've got the deals and it's in advance. But if we were truly an organization that's doing dynamic pricing, where it's live, we're going to run into something else now, where now the consumer knows that this brand, this location is doing dynamic pricing. And so we did a study where we surveyed customers and we basically primed them through some questions up front. One was, you're going on vacation. Another one, let's talk about your last time you were booking something. So really there were some questions unrelated to this eye tracking study that we did and understanding what they would choose. But one was basically primed to be like, hey, dynamic pricing is a thing based on the questions that prime them. And there's something else was completely unrelated. And through the study, we saw that those that had that primer, that top of mind, that dynamic pricing is a thing, when they went through the menu study and selected items, they were studying the menu longer. They were looking for the deals, like they were paying attention to the prices. And ultimately, the group that was primed with this concept of dynamic pricing spent less. They bought less, like they didn't buy the expensive items, they spent less. So even if we take the framework out now here and say, okay, we're going to be communicating and transparent and being transparent of, let's call it dynamic pricing, that may have an element of some surge components, let's call it that, you might end up really hurting yourself, because now the consumers are coming in, because we're not trying to trick them. As we talked about earlier, we don't want to be sneaky about it. We want that to be transparent. But now you go into that setting and you might have this kind of check management that may be going on. So they're coming to your establishment because there's other value and other things and reasons, they want to come back to you, but you're going to get this extra layer of kind of consumer response that may not pan out the way you want. So it does get really tricky when we think of like the dynamic and where it's really just live. Going back to transparency and programs that are pre-established, I think those can work, like the happy hour, Taco Tuesday, but the consumer knows when it's coming. Once you're out there as a location or brand that's truly changing things by the hour, just be prepared that they might spend more time. And by the way, the drive-through times that we've worked really hard to reduce through the pandemic might get longer, because they're going to sit there at the menu panel and be like, am I getting fooled? Like, what am I looking at? And maybe I was going to get this item, but I swear it was priced at X when I stopped by yesterday, right? And so now, going back to the efficiency statement, we're like back to the start, because the consumers are going to be trying to manage it. So it's really, it really does become tricky. And I love this study. I was just reading up with the team, and was presented in Europe at a conference, but it really does show, like, if it's top of mind for the customer, they're going to behave differently.
Yeah, and it sounds like their perception was that they were treated unfairly.
Mm-hmm.
Is what I'm hearing from you. What was the result then in terms of their? I assume there was an impact on spend,
Yep.
and items ordered. I mean, did you see results with that as well?
So the group that was primed with dynamic actually spent less. So their average check. So where they looked in the menu, they definitely spent more attention and focus on parts of the menu. So you could tell they were spending more time reading the menu, and their spend was less, and they purchased less expensive items. So some of the premium items. So there was ultimately an impact to check in the groups. So.
Okay, interesting. What specific data points then do you suggest or restaurant operators should focus on when or if they're contemplating implementing dynamic pricing to sort of avoid this, this risk of resistance?
Yeah, no, great question. So, RMS has been around for 30 years, right? And while we're not dynamically pricing by the hour, we are using consumer data points, right? So we're understanding price sensitivity. So where there's some opportunities, and Mike brought it up earlier with brands that can really optimize the money, the revenue and the profit by understanding more store level strategies. So some of the big brands do have different pricing from store to store. You could have locations that are 2 miles apart, and the pricing might be slightly different. Now, we're not talking large differences, because I think that goes back to consumer sentiment. We're not going to have a 50% swing on a product. But in the game of dimes, for a lot of our QSR clients, right, that can make a big difference. So understanding sensitivity at the unit level creates a lot of opportunity. So units that might be more price sensitive to price increases, when you're taking price changes or promoting, right? A unit that might be highly price sensitive, and it's a place that you're actually doing a lot more discounting, is actually an indicator where doing more discounting at those locations might provide those benefits, right? So in the world of trying to gain traffic, and thinking about our clients, if there's a goal to gain traffic for the system, there's opportunity to do more targeted marketing in locations that are more price sensitive. And you can drill down to that price sensitivity by day part, by customer segments. So you could go into, if we take, Mike's talking about some of the casual brands, right? We could go into a casual chain and look at the transaction ticket data and understand the sensitivity of parties that are food only, right? Parties that only are alcohol and snacks. I mean, you could basically segment the data and understand and define customer segments through the data, and then build deals and offers by day of week, by day part, by customer. And then when you start getting into the customer, understanding what they're buying, then you can build bundles, right?
So beyond dynamic pricing, I heard bundles, which is something we've been covering in droves of late.
Yeah.
And it seems like that would be an alternative strategy to this entire conversation. Is there any other alternative strategy that you can think of that operators should maybe keep top of mind?
Yeah, and as Sherri brought it up as well about menu engineering, that's definitely been a hot topic. We've had a lot of potential clients come to us to understand, how do we optimize the menu? So how do you optimize spend once the customer is in restaurant? And so there are definitely opportunities on how customers read the menu. We've been doing a lot of research with eye tracking goggles, so we're understanding where the customers are looking within the menu. Are there optimal spots in the menu? Can we drive the customer into those items? SKU rationalization, I think that's definitely a time again. A lot of brands went through that with COVID and really rethought their menu and cut items. So are there opportunities to reconsider, what products you're offering? Can you engineer certain products that might be more profitable, that communicate value? So I think there's a lot of menu work that can still be done that helps drive some of that spend without necessarily, taking price.
Very good. I want to be mindful of time, but I want to certainly end on a note, wrapping all of this up with a neat little bow, if I can, even though it's certainly a complex topic. But going back to what Sherri pointed out is the most important piece here, and that is consumer perception. And I kind of want to lob this over to Sherri and Mike and with you, Alfonso, on how restaurants can manage that risk of consumer backlash as this conversation evolves. I would argue as it picks up. We've got tools now like digital menu boards that are actually showing menu pricing changes in real time that complicates things even more. So, Sherri, and with your final thoughts on how restaurants can manage that risk. We all talked about how bad we felt for the Wendy's comms team coming into this. So, what is your recommendation here on that management?
And again, allow the customers to have control. Because if they lose control, there's going to be a backlash. And back to what Dora was talking about with the study, which sounds fascinating, by the way, is that consumers feeling like they're getting ripped off. When customers feel like they're being treated unfairly, they're not going to come back. And so I guess my takeaway is, don't call it dynamic pricing. Give consumers control. Think about it from the customer perspective. And also remember, there's a lot of other things that you can do besides just price to help maintain or build your margin.
Okay. Mike, what are your thoughts here?
I'm going to wrap it up where I started. This is tricky. It's a tricky business, right? And restaurants are a lot more complex than a hotel, in terms of selling to customers and getting them in your door, and you're reliant on way more transactions. Some great ideas here were talked about that may be difficult to execute. Alfonso talked about, eliminating low margin items. Yeah, well, if everything's being made at the sandwich station now, all of a sudden you have a throughput issue in your kitchen, right? This is an industry with so many variables and so many pitfalls on some of these things. I think chains have to be very thoughtful about executing this stuff when there's more tried and true methods, like Dora talked about, segmenting your customers and targeting them with bundles and discounts and whatever that may be, right? Just kind of lazily raising and lowering prices when you're busy or slow doesn't really, I don't know if that's going to work in this business.
Sure. And that's a good point, because a lot of people are just now learning about this, and they might think that's what it is. So Alfonso, bring us home. What are your thoughts on how restaurants can sort of manage that potential for customer backlash here?
I mean, I think, again, first of all, be upfront. Don't try to sneak it in. Articulate why the value proposition of the same product or service varies, and that therefore the price should vary. Make sure that when the price changes, that is rational and predictable, right? People can think, I understand why that is the case. Avoid at all costs the risk that somebody goes to a kiosk, starts ordering something, and by the time they check out, the price of something they put on the basket at $2 is now $2.25. That will be a car crash in slow motion. We saw, again, going back to Ticketmaster, people that went to the Oasis, put the tickets on the cart at £200, and by the time that they could check out, they were £400. I mean, those are self-inflicted wounds that you definitely want to avoid. And I think, again, because this is complex and this is new for this industry, just be progressive on how dynamic and how granular you get, right? Implementing dynamic pricing is a huge change for the companies and for the customers. So I think start slow, start simple, get everybody used to the concept and what you're executing, and then take it from there. Going back to the client that I was talking about, the hotel client, one question they said is like, we heard that some people change prices depending on time of the day. And I said, let's walk before we run, right? Let's start with the basics. And then as your teams and as your customers accept that, then eventually maybe we'll never get there. But, don't think this, it's a huge spectrum of what dynamic means. I think you just have to be very pragmatic as to how you go to capture that opportunity, right? And I think Mike's point was very valid, right? It's a very unique business. I think there is opportunity there. You just have to be very smart and disciplined how you go about it. So
sure. Very good. Walk before you can run. That is a very important takeaway here. That's what we've got time for today. All of you, I appreciate your time and your insights, on this really relevant topic of dynamic pricing. To learn more about the latest consumer insights and sales and traffic trends, or to get in touch with the RMS team, be sure and visit revenuemanage.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the mailing list to stay updated on RMS, their upcoming episodes of Revenue Stream, and we look forward to seeing everybody next time. Thank you.